A cloud of suspicion surrounds the deaths of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife, whose bodies were found in their Santa Fe home.
It includes details on what Betsy Hackman was searching for before she died and the first-person view of the officers.
Gene Hackman had a hidden tunnel beneath his Santa Fe estate, and what investigators later recovered inside it did not threaten his image or his career or the way film history remembers him. It threatened something far more personal. It threatened him, the choices he made, the final decisions he carried out, and what federal investigators could now prove he had been doing in the years before his death. The moment the DNA analysis came back from the underground chamber, the investigation changed instantly. The case was pulled away from ordinary forensic channels. National security classification protocols were activated. Within hours, the story stopped being treated like the strange death of an elderly actor. It became something else. Because when you understand what the biological material in that tunnel appeared to confirm, the mystery no longer centers on whether the tunnel existed. It centers on what Gene Hackman knew, what he protected, and what he chose to keep sealed beneath his own home until the last days of his life. The surface story. Nobody questioned. The surface story was almost too easy to accept. Gene Hackman dies at 95 inside his $4 million estate outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. His wife, Betsy Arakawa, has already died. The public explanation feels tragic, but understandable. An aging man, isolated in grief, living out his final hours in silence until his failing body gives way. Betsy's death was attributed to a severe viral infection. Hackman's death was listed as heart failure. The story sounded clean, human, sad, and incomplete. For most people, even the arrival of federal agents at the property did not seem unusual at first. A man as famous as Gene Hackman had died. A private estate had to be secured. Evidence had to be handled carefully. High-profile deaths often bring extra caution. The heavy gates, the motion sensors, the thermal cameras mounted around the perimeter, the stone walls cutting the property off from the outside world. All of it could be explained away as the security habits of a Hollywood legend who had spent decades avoiding cameras, fans, and intrusion. Even the strict non-disclosure agreements signed by every person who ever worked on the estate seemed reasonable. Private, protective, understandable. And that is why the cover story worked so well. The property itself helped preserve the illusion. It sat behind walls, away from the main road network, wrapped in decades of deliberate isolation. By the time Hackman had disappeared completely from public life, the estate had stopped feeling like a celebrity home and started functioning like a controlled perimeter. People drove past and never questioned it. That was the point. But the first federal forensic team did not walk into a simple death scene. They walked into something that had been managed. And once they began reconstructing the real timeline from the estate's security systems, the entire official picture began to fracture. Betsy Arakawa died 7 days before Gene Hackman. 7 days. During that window, the estate recorded no outgoing calls, no emergency services, no family contacts, no doctor, no request for help. A 95-year-old man with documented heart disease remained inside a sealed compound with his wife's body and did not contact anyone. At first, that could be grief, shock, confusion. But then investigators pulled the internal system logs. The furniture in the bedroom had been moved. Personal safes had been forced open. And on the same day Betsy died, Gene Hackman manually disabled the internal surveillance cameras while keeping the external perimeter alarms operating at maximum sensitivity. That detail changed everything, because that is not panic. That is not a random act of grief. It is structure. One system was blinded, another system was preserved. Behavioral analysts reviewing the security configuration reached the same conclusion. This did not look like emotional collapse. It looked like a containment process, a deliberate arrangement meant to conceal what happened inside while preventing anything outside from entering unnoticed. And that is where the story becomes bad news specifically for Hackman, because the evidence did not describe a man helplessly trapped by circumstances. It described a man making decisions, intentional decisions, repeated decisions, right up to the end. Decisions that appeared to be connected to something beneath the estate. What LiDAR found in the bedrock? The physical inconsistencies forced investigators to look deeper. Federal teams brought in LiDAR scanning equipment and thermal imaging systems to map the ground beneath the property. LiDAR works by sending rapid laser pulses and measuring how long they take to return, allowing investigators to build detailed three-dimensional models of hidden voids and structures without breaking the surface. It is the same kind of technology used to reveal ancient cities beneath dense jungle canopies. Here, it was pointed downward through the floor of a dead man's home. On the first scan, the system detected a temperature anomaly. It ran from behind the wall of Hackman's private library and dropped through solid New Mexico bedrock. Investigators checked the scan against county planning records. There was nothing. No registered tunnel, no civil record, no permit, no structural disclosure. Officially, the underground space did not exist. The entrance was hidden behind a bookshelf, not a theatrical secret door, not a novelty mechanism built for drama. The locking system was mechanical, heavy, and brutally practical. No wireless trigger, no biometric scan, no electronic switch. Just steel bolts embedded in wood and metal, released through a precise sequence of physical actions that had to be performed by hand. That design had a purpose. It produced no radio signal. It worked during a power outage. It could not be hacked remotely. It could not be accidentally triggered by a device. It was built for secrecy, endurance, and silence. Agents opened the passage and went down. The upper section of the tunnel was modern. Poured concrete, steel reinforcement, industrial beams, the kind of construction that suggested mid-20th century security standards. A structural engineer attached to the Federal Forensic Response Team examined the rivet pattern and reportedly identified a configuration associated with military-grade construction from the 1950s. The spacing and pour method matched standards he had only seen in classified federal installations, but 40 feet below the surface, the tunnel changed. The concrete ended. The steel disappeared. The walls became rough stone, carved with thousands of primitive tool marks. The air shifted too. Humidity rose and fell unnaturally. Temperature gradients moved in ways that did not fit a simple buried passage. Oxidized metallic particles were suspended in the atmosphere, suggesting prolonged exposure to materials or processes that should not have existed in a sealed chamber under a private estate. The lower tunnel was not modern. It was hand-carved, older than the estate, older than the 1950s reinforcement above it. Whatever its original purpose had been, the modern construction did not create it. It concealed it. The estate had not been built with a tunnel beneath it. The estate had been built over something already there. And what investigators found at the bottom is what turned the case from strange to classified. What the DNA confirmed. Dust samples from the tunnel's mechanical locking system were sent for microforensic examination. The task was simple: determine whether the entrance had been used recently. Special forensic technician Raymond Voss examined the gears under magnification. He was searching for signs inconsistent with long-term disuse. What he found made him stop before writing his report. The abrasion marks were fresh, not old, not years old, not months old, days old. And the timing aligned with the 7-day window between Betsy Arakawa's death and Gene Hackman's. The implication was unavoidable. Hackman had not spent his final days motionless in bed. At some point after his wife died, he had opened the hidden mechanism. He had descended into the tunnel. He had operated the heavy locking system himself, and he had returned before his own death. But the mechanical evidence was only the beginning. Organic material recovered deeper in the chamber produced DNA results that changed the investigation entirely. The full classification of what was identified has not been publicly released, but sources close to the early forensic review indicated that the genetic material did not match an innocent explanation like old storage, casual contamination, or decades of human contact. It suggested biological conditions that should not have existed in an isolated subterranean space beneath a private estate. The response was immediate. The case was removed from standard investigative channels and routed through national security classification protocols. Not historical preservation, not archaeological curiosity. Active concern. That phrase matters. Active concern. The DNA did not suggest a dormant relic. It suggested biological activity. Something in that chamber had produced recoverable genetic material. And the people with authority to classify the results decided within hours that the public should not be told what it was. That finding could not be separated from the timeline. Betsy dies. Hackman disables internal cameras, but keeps the perimeter protected. 7 days pass with no calls. The tunnel mechanism shows fresh use. DNA from the chamber indicates biological activity inconsistent with dormancy. Each detail alone might be explainable. Together, they point in one direction. A man in the final week of his life, with a failing heart, carrying out specific actions in a specific order. Not randomly, not emotionally, methodically, like someone following a protocol he had performed many times before. And the federal response reinforced that interpretation. When investigators arrive at the scene of an elderly man's natural death, they do not usually classify biological evidence. They do not deploy signal shielding equipment. They do not place national security holds on municipal complaints from years earlier. The shape of the response said more than any public statement ever could. Atmospheric samples from the lowest chamber reportedly registered compounds associated with organic metabolic processes. Not ancient residue, not simple geological off-gassing. Active compounds associated with living biological systems. Those results were sealed under the same classification order as the DNA analysis. Both were locked down within the same 12-hour window. By then, the team was moving toward the far side of the underground chamber, and what they found there reframed the entire estate. The chamber, the listening cable, and the door. At the base of the tunnel was a chamber unlike anything the investigators expected. The natural stone floor had been leveled by human hands. Across it were engravings arranged like astronomical coordinates, mapping planetary orbits with mathematical precision. Wooden crates were scattered nearby. Inside them were metallurgical components of unknown origin, some cast as single solid pieces without seams or weld lines, using techniques that did not fit documented early 20th century industrial methods. But the crates and markings were not what stopped the room. Mounted along the rough stone wall was a closed-circuit communication system. A thick coaxial cable, insulated with dense industrial rubber, ran through the chamber wall and up through bedrock toward the estate above. It was not connected to the main electrical grid. It was powered by an independent battery array designed to operate during a total surface failure. Electrical systems analyst Dr. Claire Souza examined the circuit and found evidence that it was not abandoned. Its casing had been cleaned. Its connectors had been maintained. Its components had been protected against the damp cavern environment. The system was active. But it was not a normal communication line. There was no microphone, no speaker, no voice mechanism. For years, perhaps decades, Hackman had not simply been living above the tunnel. He had been listening, not to voices, not to radio broadcasts, not to the outside world. He had been listening to vibrations coming from the far side of a sealed wall beneath his house. At the terminal end of the cable, where the chamber narrowed unnaturally into the rock, investigators found the door. A massive iron barrier set into the stone, carbon steel, weathered, completely flat. No handle, no visible hinges, no keypad, no lock. Every seam around its perimeter had been welded shut. Continuous weld lines, unbroken, permanent, applied from the exterior. This was the detail that broke the framework completely. A bunker door is built so the people inside can control entry and exit. It has mechanisms, bolts, hinges, a way to open. This was different. A door sealed from the outside with no mechanism on either face is not built to protect those inside. It is built to contain whatever is beyond it, to keep it there, permanently. Once that detail was understood, every feature of the estate above changed meaning. The stone walls, the isolated road access, the perimeter cameras, the employee silence, the strict non-disclosure agreements, Hackman disabling his internal surveillance after his wife died while leaving the exterior defenses active. None of it looked like the paranoia of a famous man hiding from the public anymore. It looked like the behavior of a warden. Not a man protecting himself from the world. A man protecting the world from whatever was behind that welded door. For years, perhaps for the last 2 decades of his life, Gene Hackman may have been the sole civilian caretaker of a geological containment structure. The estate's security prevented accidental access. The hidden tunnel remained concealed. The monitoring line allowed him to track vibrations from whatever pressed against the far side of the barrier, day after day, night after night. And then came the most unsettling part of the federal response. The government had plasma cutting equipment on site, industrial tools capable of breaching steel within minutes. But no one was authorized to use them. Agents documented the welds. They studied the door. They examined the star map carved into the chamber floor. And then they chose not to open it. The barrier remained sealed. The door Gene Hackman had spent his life keeping closed stayed closed. The final 7 days and the information lockdown. Once reports describing the welded door, the listening cable, and the classified DNA results reached Central Command, evidence collection was halted. A full information lockdown was imposed. No forensic documentation was released. Local reporters approaching the perimeter were turned away. The surrounding forest land was placed under special government control under urgent national security provisions. Freedom of Information Act requests for structural plans were denied under high-level classification protocols. Then investigators discovered the erased records. Municipal complaints filed from 2019 onward had reportedly disappeared from state databases accessible to civilian researchers. The complaints described recurring low-frequency vibrations underground, often around 2 a.m. Local authorities had once dismissed them as plumbing interference or underground heating infrastructure. Now the records were gone. Unmarked military transport convoys arrived at the estate under cover of darkness. They carried signal shielding technology. Their movements did not resemble archaeology. They did not resemble routine forensics. They resembled the return of an apparatus that already knew what was there. The evidence points toward a disturbing conclusion. Some unseen authority had long known about the tunnel, the chamber, the welded door, and the listening system. They did not respond like people discovering something new. They moved like people reclaiming an asset. One they had allowed a single civilian to guard, maintain, and finance for decades, while remaining invisible in the background. Only when the last watchman died did they step back into view. And that leaves the question no one in the original coverage stopped to ask. If Gene Hackman was acting alone, why did a classified response protocol already seem to exist? Why were cutting teams present but prohibited from opening the door? Why were FOIA requests blocked almost immediately at a classification level that normally requires a national security chain of approval? The speed of the response does not look like shock. It looks like management. A known situation had become exposed. When all of the evidence is placed together, Hackman's silence during the 7 days after Betsy's death stops looking like grief alone. It becomes a final protocol. The moment Betsy died, Hackman faced a brutal calculation. One emergency call would bring police, paramedics, forensic teams, and eventually media. People with no knowledge of the tunnel, no understanding of the containment structure. No reason not to search the home. They would move through the rooms. They would find the library. They might discover the mechanism. And simple human curiosity, not malice, could interrupt the system, expose the tunnel, or draw attention to the iron door. So Hackman chose silence. He disabled the cameras. He protected the perimeter. He opened the passage. He descended the stone stairs one last time. He checked the locks. He verified the containment. Then he returned to the surface, to the silent house, to the concealed speaker still carrying the low-frequency rhythm from beneath the bedrock. And he listened until his own heart stopped. The Santa Fe incident was closed without public explanation. The astronomical coordinates, the classified DNA findings, the active analog monitoring system. None of it would ever be resolved in a standard investigation. It was transferred, sealed, and buried again. This time, not under stone, under classification. The agents withdrew. The scanning systems were packed away. The estate vanished deeper into restricted records. And beneath the New Mexico bedrock, the corroded iron door remains closed, its welds unbroken. Far below the desert surface, beyond ordinary perception, the low vibration continues in the dark. The same rhythm Gene Hackman was alive to hear. Whatever he spent his final years listening to is still there. Only now, someone else is listening. If this story raised more questions than it answered, it should. Subscribe for more investigations that follow the trail where the official record ends.